So why don't we get started? Very happy to have Peter Arcidiacono here, visiting from Duke for many reasons, but he's back again, and that's a pleasure. Uh, Peter got is at Duke. He got his degree from Wisconsin, and his undergraduate degree from out here on the West Coast, Wilmette, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, not too far away up in Oregon. And he's he's talked to us before. I scratched my brain and remembered a few times. I think I had to challenge Peter's brain a little bit, but that's okay. And the topic is a variant, but a very important topic. So I'll read the title. It's What the Students for Fair Admission Cases Reveal About Racial Preferences. It's a joint paper with Josh Kessler and Tyler Ransom. And so we're open ears. But
Great.
can we interrupt as you go? Is that
Oh,
okay?
please.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. You have some slides too, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thanks a lot for having me. Gotta put the disclaimer here. First, this comes out of my work as an expert witness in two cases. The one that most people know about is the one against Harvard, but there was also another one against UNC. The issues are slightly different in the two cases. Everything I'm going to be doing comes from the public records in the case. So I basically got a lot of tables into my reports. My intent was always to do research on these cases. We've written 4 papers out of the cases so far. These 4 all come from the Harvard side. 2 on legacy handling preferences. Second one's more historical trends. That's my presentation. Then one on discrimination, and then one on practices. And so now these 4 have been published. It's been interesting because each time stuff tends to get some attention until this last one. And this last one is about the racial preferences. So, which is what the Supreme Court's actually decided about. That was released on my website for a little bit, but came out as an MBR working paper on Monday. I think there's been one tweet about that one. And what's interesting about that is there was just a poll that got sent to me today from Pew. And being in academics and not being in Vancouver, you feel really like a fish out of water, bringing up some possible nuances.
John, pardon me, but I'm having a really hard time. The speaker's cutting in and out a lot, so I'm having a hard time hearing. Anybody else have a trouble?
Is it better now?
Fading in and out. You can't hear.
Is this better now, Judd?
Is it better now with me talking into the microphone?
That's better. I don't know whether you're turning away at times or what. But
just tilt it more toward you.
Okay.
Thank
I'll try to do better talking into the microphone.
Thank you.
No problem. So they just had this Pew poll. They've done these in the past. And as somebody who studies affirmative action, you'd think I would not be surprised by what the polls show. And yet I'm routinely surprised. So in this case, they asked about a whole series of factors. And you were supposed to respond with whether the factor should be a major, minor, or not a factor in admission. And 74% said race and ethnicity should not be a factor in admissions. 7% said it should be a major factor. So 74% said not a factor at all. Only 7% said it should be a major factor. Now, what is a major factor? Well, we'll talk about different ways you can measure that, and you can make up your own mind whether I'm showing you it's a major factor or not. This is true even among African Americans, where 59% said it should not be a factor. And among Democrats, 62% not a factor. So it's a pretty stunning contrast to what you would think, at least being in a university setting. So, and actually, the way I frame the paper is not so much about whether there should be affirmative action, but to me, if you're going to be for affirmative action, there should at least be some discussion of how much. There's both the extensive margin about whether to have it at all, but if you are going to have it, what is that intensive margin? And there's a large space between race as a tiebreaker and the equal outcomes that somebody like Abraham Kendi would support.
Can I just ask you about the sample that the Pew surveyed? I mean, how did they get this?
It's a stunning number, isn't it?
It's definitely stunning. That says it probably wasn't a random sample, or I'm completely wrong.
That's right. So it's actually fairly consistent. It depends on how you ask the question, for sure. So Alesina Stancheva, and I'm blanking on the third co-author, just had a paper out, and so they did their own surveys, and among both adults, and they asked like a sample of teenagers, are you in favor? And there was blacks were like at 51%. Democrats again were against it. Republicans were definitely against it. But what's interesting is they asked another question, which is, do you think the government should do something to promote equal opportunities for different racial groups? And there's agreement, both Republicans and Democrats, over 50% said yes. So if you ask a question about affirmative action without specifying preferences in college admissions, that's when you'll start to see more support. But what do they mean? What people mean by that is a little
So could
vague.
it be the case that people don't understand that racial preferences exist?
I don't think they know exactly how it applies. I mean, I was even talking to a group of freshmen at Duke, and they were like, what is affirmative action in admissions? Like, how is that possible that you wouldn't know that? Of course, but there is a lot of strange information out there. So that survey with Alesina and Stancheva, they also asked, what percent of the population do you think is Black in the US? And the respondents said over 40%. And I think that's reflective of the news media coverage and things of that nature that give you a distorted perception of what the numbers actually are.
I just don't live where I live.
Frank, isn't it true in California that we had a referendum on the ballot to restore affirmative action in higher education, and went down in defeat by 58% or something like that again?
It was amazing how skewed that vote was in an election that was designed. You would have thought the timing was perfect. I mean, Donald Trump was on the ballot in California. You think if there was ever a time when they could have gotten racial preferences back in, it would have been then. And it actually failed by a wider margin than when Prop 209, which banned racial preferences, was passed. So it's a pretty stunning indictment.
I was just thinking of the people that don't vote would be more likely to be the people that would.
Oh, I see.
That was. But you're right. I agree.
So what's interesting about this is, part of why I wanted to do these cases is I study affirmative action higher education, but to tell you even how much it's going on, at what level it's happening, you can't do it because they hide their data. And they have good reasons to hide their data. The Supreme Court's actually given them a great incentives to do so, because in the twin Michigan decisions, they basically said you cannot have an explicit point system, but you can take it into account race holistically. Now, as an economist, I can write it down as a formula, whether it's explicit or implicit. You know, everything we can quantify the role that race plays, even if we don't have the explicit formula. But that gives you an incentive to hide what you're doing if it might expose you to, say, lawsuits. But I think that when I think about some of my objections to affirmative action, there's sort of two primary objections on the more conservative side. One isn't just a matter of fairness. Why would we treat people differently on the basis of race? And then the second is more related to the mismatch hypothesis, where at some point you're going to put people at places that are so far above where they're at that they're not going to do so well. I will say that, you know, and I've done a lot of work on that issue. A little bit of affirmative action can't run into that issue. You know, so if you give, everybody should be in favor of getting some small preferences for themselves. That's going to put you in a good spot. Where you can run into issues is when the preferences become super large. Then maybe like the last set of people getting in, it may actually do have worse outcomes. So, but in light of the fact that people don't have great information, this is where we can have some issues. So the paper I'm citing here is one we were talking about earlier that actually led to a protest at Duke. And the protest was over actually a data fact that I think at first they just didn't believe, which was that African Americans and whites were coming into Duke wanting to major in STEM and economics at basically the same rate. But 54% of Black men who started in STEM switched out, that's STEM and economics, switched out compared to just 8% of white men. Now I've cherry picked this because if you look at women, it's not quite as extreme. But the main thing here is that to the extent it's not clear how much they know this information ahead of time. And I feel like they should at least be informed of these things. So I think one of the big things that I want to push is the idea that there ought to at least be some transparency. And you can do this without things that lead to racial stereotyping. So you don't even have to make it about race. You could just say, you wanted to major in economics, given your test scores and grades, here's the probability that that will happen at the school. And then people can make up their own mind as to what they want to do. And they can also invest in more resources if they're like, okay, I really actually do want to do this degree at this university. But it would also put the schools on the hook a little bit to give them, like if you're going to admit them, to give them the resources that they need.
Can you explain all this difference with test scores and?
Yes. So yeah, I should say once you control for differences in academic background, that goes away. And I think that's the part that was troubling to them because it wasn't about, well, there were a few things there. One, it wasn't saying that the sciences were racist. Okay. The other side of it too is that, you know, some of the pushback, and I think that's happening right now, is that there, the sciences need to be more welcoming to all people. So it's not about race, but the reality is that you don't have weed out courses in the humanities in the way you have in the sciences. And from a disparate impact perspective, weed out courses hit those more who are coming in with worse academic backgrounds. So
Academic background is SAT score, high school GPA, what else?
well, I think that in a lot of times you can get things like what high school you went to, advanced placement exams,
Got it.
those kinds of
Okay.
things. I mean, there's a movement away from test
That's what
scores.
basically an answer to Rick's question that makes the effect go away.
Exactly.
I mean, the question is, what are the correlates to the switch out of STEM?
That's right. And you can see that it's very clear. SAT math score is incredibly important to that. And so like if you look at the recent debate in California about test scores and whether they should be used in the UC system, what they'll say is that high school GPA does a much better job of predicting your college grades than the test scores. But there's a couple things going on there. The first is that if you are coming in with higher test scores relative to your GPA, you're actually more likely to take classes in the sciences and such that give lower grades. So that you end up with this bias in terms of how you think about what the high school and the test scores matter a lot more. Math tests matters a lot more to your grades in things like the sciences and so on, which makes sense. They also tend to do better at predicting, I think, just performance in larger classes. So I think what you'll see is, like, for example, boys tend to do better in the sciences relative to girls. Girls still get higher grades in college than boys, even in the sciences, but there's not that big of a gap given how much more girls are studying. You know, girls study way more than guys do. But the way the composition of the course is constructed, the bigger classes tend to rely more on tests, and tests relatively favor guys as opposed to, you know, other forms of assessment. But getting distracted here, the hiding the university data, I think this is a hugely important thing. I think we could do so much more to help kids succeed if we would focus in on that. We have all these, it's amazing to me that Duke houses data on all public school students in North Carolina, right? Which you can use for research, and tons of papers have come out of this. And yet, to look at data on Duke students, it's probably because there's a protest over my paper on Duke students, they don't let you do that. And in fact, our department has asked for the data, not to publish, but to say, we want to identify students ahead of time who might struggle and then give them the resources to succeed. They didn't want to give us that data, right? And I think because I think if they saw what was actually going on, they lose their plausible deniability, right? And then they might actually have to do something. I think that this importance of information is compounded when students don't have access to good information. So just what we talked about, people just don't have I do a lot of work with these dynamic structural models where we're making assumptions about rational expectations and people having all the right information. It's clear in some of these cases that that's not the case. And that can compound these issues. So for this presentation, I'm going to focus on 3 sets of applicants. The first is from Harvard. These are the classes that if they graduated in 4 years would have done so 2014, 2019. And then we're going to break out the UNC data into 2 sets, out-of-state admissions and in-state. And I should say that throughout, this is only going to be covering domestic applicants. We're not looking at international applicants here at all. The reason we separate out out-of-state and in-state admissions is you can see it up on the slide that the admit rate's very different. North Carolina caps their out-of-state enrollments at 18%. And so that leads to a much more competitive admissions process. So admit rate there is under 17%, while in-state is almost 52 during this period. So
you're going to focus on education, higher education. There's what about the military? Can you say briefly what about the military? That's much different, right?
Yeah, I don't actually know a lot about the military side, except to the extent that AFQT has been sort of shown to be very predictive of success, regardless of without being like a racially biased score. And actually, to that point about like the racial bias issue, the fact that once you account for the test scores and in the academic background, there is no difference, would have to be like somehow the racial bias in the tests exactly. Yeah, I mean, it would be amazing if that were the case.
Remember to speak closer to the mic when asking questions.
All right, so we're gonna use information in public reports. So actually, all this information has actually been there. It's just buried in my thick reports. People have read some of the Harvard ones. I don't even know that people know the UNC ones. And actually, let me do that as just a pop quiz. Who knows who the expert was in the UNC case?
Guard. We know who the expert was in the Harvard case.
You know, that was the Harvard case.
And
Is your call? It's Carolyn Hawksby is in the UNC case. So that just shows you how little attention it was a pretty amazing. The Harvard case got tons of attention. The UNC case, there was none. We're going to focus. This was a big debate in the Harvard case about how to handle particular kinds of applicants. Maybe it's because I'm from Duke. You know, when I think about recruited athletes and the basketball players at Duke, it's a different admissions process than when you think about what's happening there. Yet that was a big.
Never guessed that.
And it turns out to matter.
It's an exception.
When I came here before, I've already actually shared this number with you, but Harvard has more varsity sports than any school in the country. And so you end up with, over 16% of white admits being recruited athletes. That's way higher than the other racial group. And that's in part because while the first couple sports that a school has might be very diverse, the last sports that get added are not, because there's sports like sailing. Not to poke fun at the institution that's hosting me here at Stanford, but it was sort of amazing to do we just released this paper on the legacy and athlete admissions, and then the varsity blues thing hit. And what was it at Stanford? It was the sailing team. So it was interesting. So we've got numbers with those people in there, but I'm generally going to focus on when it's happening through the more normal admissions process. I think race doesn't matter as much for the legacies and the recruited athletes in the same way. So everything is going to come from the public record, and here's sort of the ordering of when these reports were written. I had no idea who the other expert was going to be till I got the report back. And I was learning throughout. So some of the stuff that I'm going to have in the UNC paper, I won't have in the Harvard because I didn't figure it out until, better way of presenting the results until later.
When you say that they're experts, let's know what side they're on.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I was on the plaintiff side in both cases. And so, and I should also say what the issues were. So in the Harvard case, there are sort of three issues that experts were testifying on. One is Harvard discriminating against Asian American applicants relative to white applicants? Then you have how are the size of the racial preferences permissible? I can't say whether the size are permissible. I can tell you how big they are. And then there was a third aspect that I was not involved with, which was race-neutral alternatives. And so there was a separate expert, Rick Kallenberg, in the Harvard case to examine whether there were plausible race-neutral alternatives. Both Card and Hawksby did the race-neutral alternatives themselves to contradict Rick's testimony. In the UNC case, there's actually no claim of Asian American discrimination. So it's really about the size of the preferences and whether race-neutral alternatives could be used. And you'll see the differences in Harvard and UNC. My view is that what's happening to Asian Americans at Harvard is happening at plenty of other elite institutions. You can see it a bit in the DOJ did an investigation of Yale that when Biden came in that got cut, that investigation. But you could see that the same patterns were happening at Yale as they were in Harvard. The difference with UNC is that North Carolina doesn't have a large Asian population, so they don't have to worry about being overrun in the same way that some of these other colleges would appear to be reacting to.
I have one general comment on this, is that you always make the language makes a distinction between racial preferences and Asian American distinctions. I have some Asian American friends. I just had dinner with a couple of them a couple months ago, and I don't think they like that they're not regarded as a racial discrimination. It's race,
Yeah.
race. And but my impression is when you talk about racial discrimination, it's Black and Hispanic.
That's right. For this paper, that's right. I mean, we've done a whole other paper just on that issue. And I'm very sympathetic to that for sure. I mean, that was something, I didn't even have any background. I talked to some of my former students who were Asian. They're like, oh yeah, we knew this the whole time. But I didn't know that. And I studied higher education. A lot of it just had to do with the data, because you have to have really good data to be able to get at this.
I remember news stories about 10 or 15 years ago about Asian applicants from Palo Alto being examined by Harvard, and the conversations were, well, we've got enough Asians from Palo Alto. So, I mean, this has been.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because that's something that we always control for the location that you're applying from, but even those things work against Asian Americans.
Yeah. So, I mean, I read about it in the newspaper about this anti-Asian group.
Yeah.
So it's maybe it's not in the data that you use, but.
Oh well, it definitely is. At Harvard, we find clear penalty for sure. UNC just is a different case. Yeah. So both these things went to trial. Yeah, they both went to trial. Except now I'm even wondering if those dates are right about the replies, because and testified at both of them. The first thing I want to talk about with regard to how the admissions process works is that, remember those twin Supreme Court cases that I mentioned where you can't use race as a formula, but you can use it holistically? That turned out to be a massive handout to private elite private schools. They're just in a much better position resource-wise to spend a lot of time reviewing those applicants. And you can see that in how the applications are scored. So these are all the things where a number is filled in for by the admissions officer. I mean, the alumni do the interviews at Harvard, and then they will get put in, but everything else is stuff that the admissions officer fills out. And so you can see that, on academics, Harvard has an academic rating. UNC has a program rating, which is basically, how many AP classes you're taking, that sort of thing. And then a performance rating, which is, basically a GPA and whether it was going up or down. Then they both have extracurricular ratings. They both have these sort of nebulous personal ratings. And UNC actually ranks the essay. Harvard doesn't. Harvard also has an athletic rating for everybody. This includes the non-recruited athletes. And then they actually rank the letters of recommendation. UNC only requires one letter of recommendation. Harvard, you're going to get something from a counselor and those 2 teacher letters. So you can see already holistic admissions is going to be something that's going to actually be very beneficial to those elites that can mask what they're doing a bit more.
Of course, it depends how much these things count.
That's right.
An alumni evaluation, in my experience, has very little impact on admission to certain schools.
Yeah.
Even though it's listed there, it's irrelevant in many cases.
So I think it does matter in the sense that basically if you don't do that alumni interview, it's one of those things where they say it's optional, but it's really not. So, but that could be highly correlated with everything else about you that you would get get that interview. What's nice about having that alumni interview is we actually have an external measure of the personal rating. And if I thought about where bias against Asian Americans would be, it would be more from those alumni interviews than from the admissions officers who probably had their implicit bias training and all those things. And that's not the case. It's the case that it's the admissions officers who are really scoring them low on the personal rating. There's some evidence actually of a penalty by alumni, but it's just minuscule in comparison to what the admissions officers are doing. So just to give you an idea, how are we doing on time? Just so I want to make sure I don't.
About half of
Okay.
your head.
Great. Actually, it's 1 there too, I guess. So, and we go until when?
1:30.
Okay, great.
Can I interrupt here? You keep talking about, I'm Paul Peterson, I'm at Harvard, and you keep talking about the admissions officers, but I thought that at Harvard, it was a committee that decided this. And it was a committee that was, they had faculty on there, and they had also, a range of people on there. So it used to be that way. So I don't know what it is now, but maybe you know more than I do about it.
So the actual admissions decisions are made by a committee. In order to get to the committee, you go through the reading process. And so the way that's going to work is they'll have a first person read your file. And if that person thinks the file has some promise, then they'll have another person read it. And then it would get taken to the committee. So they just have way too many files to discuss all those files in committees. And so the way if we go back to how these things are scored, these are scored by the admissions officers, with the exception of those alumni ratings that they're taking from what the alumni said. And the scores that are in the database, we believe, are from sort of the final reader, because the second reader could change those scores if they wanted on their read of the file. So just to show you sort of, here's the admit rate after you take out those special groups. And you can see that, once you take out like Harvard legacies and athletes, the admission rate for Asian Americans is actually slightly higher than that of whites. If those groups were in there, the Asian American rate would be lower. The other thing you can see is that African American and Hispanics have the highest admit rates at Harvard and for UNC out of state, but they actually have the lowest admit rates for UNC in state. Okay. I don't think I'll spend too much time on the other ones, but you can also see why for Asian Americans it's going to be different at Harvard, because 28% of their applicant pool at Harvard is Asian American, and it's going much lower for UNC out of state and UNC in state. The fact that it's higher for UNC out of state, given that they're only going to take 18% there, the in-state sort of most relevant for how many Asian Americans are going to be at the campus. Go for it.
Sorry, just clarifying question. Can you talk about why these are the 4 categories that are studied and how this aggregation works? So for example, you could think of white could be broken up into Jewish versus other groups. Asian American obviously has many.
Right.
Hispanic has white Hispanic. And this is not how the Census Bureau thinks of Hispanic. I don't know if you can comment a little bit. This came up in the cases, or how you think about this.
Yeah, so it's they keep track of race many different ways. So I think that there are some measures of race that might break down Asian a little bit more, but they have these things called Harvard one-pagers, which are showing what the characteristics of the class look like at different points in time. And it might be broken out a little finer than this, but not much, not splitting out Asian Americans at all. They will never have whether you're Jewish on those one-pagers. And what's interesting about that is that would have been a natural resolution to the lawsuit, which is you can't download particular pieces of information. Because on the Common App, they actually ask your religious affiliation. And Harvard chooses not to download that, I think in partly in response to the discrimination against the Jews that was happening in the past. So I think the only category that gets split out a bit more, I mean, we do have a separate category for Native Americans, and then sometimes we'll split out Hispanic into Mexican, and there's also a Pacific Islander category, but that's the extent of anything there.
Are these all self-identified categories? I mean, where do they actually get the boxology of who comes in the door as which type of person?
They are self-identified, and on those Harvard one pagers, they actually have 3 different ways of measuring your race. So the thing that's going to matter throughout, I'm going to use here as my measure of race is if you were Black and you also marked Asian, we're going to count you as Black. And that's one of the ways that they report race on these one pagers. Then they have one where they basically will double count you. You know, we count you if you're, and then they have the government reporting, which is the IPEDS way, which is in order to be counted as Black, you have to be only Black. Otherwise, you're going to be put in this sort of multiracial category.
That bizarrely challenging case in Massachusetts in the 1970s of the Malone brothers, who self-identified one way for purposes of being Boston firefighters under a separate racial hiring track, and then were thought by their colleagues at the department, in fact, to be a different flavor of human, and there was a fight over whether they, in fact, had accurately self-identified. I think the courts ended up punting on that, but I wonder sort of how those protocols of can one in fact self-identify in any way that one wishes, and then take advantage or disadvantage of these dynamics if you know what they are ahead of time. How does that work?
Well, there was this claim that whites were marking down that they were Native American quite a bit on their applications. I don't think that there's enough evidence of that in the Harvard case because the numbers are just going to be too small.
I wonder how you'd adjudicate that without raising even more problems than you would answer. But
well, we have a senator who's had to deal with that.
A Massachusetts senator.
So it is said, yes.
You got a job at Harvard that way.
So when you look at these numbers here, you can see that at Harvard, you can see out of state underrepresented minorities, African Americans and Hispanics have higher admit rates, lower in-state. But these numbers are incredibly misleading because there's massive difference in academic characteristics coming in. And those differences in characteristics are actually manipulated by these schools. And the way you manipulate that is through how you're going to recruit people to apply to your school. So there are very different cutoffs depending on your race and gender and so on, for whether you're going to get a letter telling you to apply to Harvard. And I suspect the same is true, at UNC.
Do you have the numbers for if you include everybody? In other words, not the legacy admits the athletes.
But yes, I don't have them on these slides. Not in the slides, but then the admission rate is by far the highest for whites. Whites goes way up. I don't know if it passes African American and Hispanic total.
Does Harvard admit students who don't apply?
Not that I'm aware of.
Stanford does.
Okay. They're not in our data in any event that I'm aware of.
Hi, Peter. Can I jump in for a quick question?
Yeah.
Nice to see you. So I find very compelling this revealed preference approach, but I have one question about the spirit of the measurement exercise in terms of characteristics you may not be able to measure well. Meaning, imagine that schools have preferences over a bundle of characteristics of applicants that are differentially distributed among different ethnic and racial groups. So how do you tease out a pure preference for racial attribute as opposed to preference for a combination of characteristics that correlate with racial elements.
I Yeah, I think that's a very good question. The argument's going to fundamentally be one that, if anything, I think we're underestimating the extent of racial preferences based on sort of a selection on observables versus unobservables argument. So whatever those other factors are, we can see how they're correlated. We know what's happening with the other characteristics that Harvard values. So it'd have to be like something orthogonal to that that's correlated with race. And with the number of characteristics that we have, we think that that's unlikely. That was certainly one of the arguments of the Harvard case, was that the stuff that's not academic is what's more likely to be in the residual than the academic stuff. But we can even look at that as well and show that on the non-academic things that we do measure, you get this sort of clear ranking where, again, it's going to be Asian Americans are strongest on the observables associated with the non-academic stuff. They're strongest than whites, than Hispanics, than African Americans, and the preferences work in the exact opposite ordering.
And then can you use, sorry, Peter, can you use exactly this type of back of the envelope to give a sense of how much we are underestimating racial preferences?
Yeah, it's not going to be by a lot, mainly because the models do a really good job at predicting. So there isn't as much scope for it. So we're going to show here, the first rows are the share of applicants and admits that are first generation, is sort of one measure of disadvantage. Anytime that you see, like among whites, the fact that the applicants are more likely to be first generation than the admits, that would tell you that the overall admit rate for first generation students is lower than those who are not first generation. But what I want to point out to you is how close those two things are for whites. So at Harvard, it's 4.28 versus 4 is the share of first generation for white versus 4.05. Sorry, yeah, 4.05 for the admits. If you look at, you get a much bigger spread when you look for African Americans. And one of the things that's going to come out of this is that if you're disadvantaged, that's going to matter a lot more if you're white than if you're African American. You're going to get a bump, a very large bump for being African American, a smaller bump for being disadvantaged. But if you're both African American and disadvantaged, you don't get the disadvantage bump.
Is it first generation American or first generation college?
First generation college.
First generation college.
Yeah. There was a very interesting study. I think the sample sizes are a bit small, but they basically found that over 40% of Ivy League enrollees who were Black were first or second generation immigrants. So it's, when we think about affirmative action as a policy to target the descendants of slaves at some of these schools, this is really not how it's working. The next set of rows, we're going to work with Z-scores. So for this, either SAT math, Z-scored at the school level. So this means I can't compare the Harvard numbers to the UNC numbers, but I could compare within UNC. So a few things to point out. If you look at African American admits, and you look at their math scores, they're going to have, in all these cases, they're going to have lower math scores than the Asian American and the white applicants, which is pretty stunning when we're talking about a school that has such a low acceptance rate as Harvard. Okay. For verbal, it's not going to be quite as extreme, but you still see some of that going on. Now, one other thing that's going to come out of this also is that the racial preferences are going to matter a lot more for out-of-state African Americans than they are for in-state African Americans. And this is actually what splits the conservative argument in half. So if you look at, whoops, I don't know if I can point here. So if you look at, you can compare these two numbers because they're both within UNC. So racial preferences are going to be bigger for UNC out of state. That's the purple ones. But they're still going to come in more with better math scores than the in-state African American admits, because admissions is so much more competitive out of state than in state. These test scores here for out of state admits look somewhat similar. They're only slightly smaller than what the in-state white admits have. So basically, one way of thinking about that is that a school that has a less than 17% admit rate, they're coming in with test scores like white students at a school that has a 50% admit rate. That's a pretty striking, I think, striking difference. So what we're going to do next, before showing you that blur of numbers, is it's sort of not really relevant what the averages are at a place like Harvard, because the admission rate is 5%. So we should really be looking at who's in the tails of the distribution, right? And so when you see that, we get a sense that African Americans and Hispanics are coming in with having higher admit rates, but much lower test scores at Harvard and UNC out of state. Now let's look at, we're going to take their test scores and grades and split you up into sort of 10 groups based upon a combination of your test scores and grades. Go top 10% going down. For that, this just shows you how they're distributed across the schools. So if you sum down, a column would always equal 1. So the maroon is again Harvard, and then the purple is UNC out of state. Too many numbers on the table anyway, so I didn't even do the UNC in state. And the way to think about this is, if Harvard is admitting based solely on academics, they would only take people in the 10th decile. That's the top one, because that would be the top 10% of applicants. Their admit rate's under 10%. If they did that, what would we see? Well, first of all, the only group that has a higher than 10% in the top 10% are Asian Americans. So 18% of Asian Americans at Harvard are in the top 10% of the applicant pool. It's about 8.6 for whites at Harvard. For African Americans, it's less than 1%. And part of what the reason for that is that they're recruiting African Americans with low test scores. So 38% of African Americans are in the bottom 10% of the applicant pool, according to academics. And you can see that the patterns are basically similar at UNC out of state. Hispanics are a bit of a difference there. They look better out of state than the African Americans. But in both cases, we're talking about almost 60% of at both schools being in the bottom 20% of academics for African Americans. Okay, and yet they have higher admit rates. So that's giving you an idea that the preferences are going to be enormous in order to get here. So this is only relevant, of course, if academics matter for admissions. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you what the admit rates are by race for each of those deciles. So basically at Harvard, you'll notice this is in the bottom 10%. Nobody gets in. These are percentage points. So 0.03% is the admit rate for African Americans, the only one that has any. That was 2 in 6 years. So that's 38% of applicants, no chance of getting in. This is where the legacy numbers are interesting, because for legacies and athletes, you would still have a chance of getting in that bottom 10%. Then you can see that when we go down, quickly, the admit rates get very high. So at Harvard, at the top decile, we're talking top 2, it's over 50% for African Americans. So you have 54.6% here. Those are in the second from the top decile. that compares to less than 8% for Asian Americans at Harvard. And, if you go down to this fourth decile, so that means you're in the 30th to 40th percentile in terms of your academic background, that number is actually higher than Asian Americans in the top 10% and lies in between the top two groups for whites. At UNC, it's out of state, the levels are a little bit different, but you're going to see a similar pattern. And as we're going to show, actually, the racial preferences are much bigger at UNC out of state than they are at Harvard. And there's going to be an explanation for that as we get a little closer. So what would happen if we admitted solely based on that academics? What would the composition of the class look like? And that's what, so in the actual for Harvard is here. And what the first thing you'll notice is that there's only one group that goes up when you go to academics only, and that's Asian Americans. So you ended up with almost 52%. Whites, they fall by just a little bit. And then African Americans, it goes from almost 16% to less than 1%. Okay? I think there are multiple ways to interpret this chart. One would be, I would term more of a racist interpretation to say, well, they just can't do some sort of inferiority thing. The other way is the Abraham-Kendi view, which would be to say there must be a problem with the measures. To me, that actually does a big disservice, the Abraham-Kendi way of basically saying, then the pre-college stuff is completely fine. But the pre-college stuff is a serious, serious issue. And that's where the focus needs to be. And there's really good work on this about how effective a lot of these no excuse charter schools are, for example, at closing those achievement gaps. That's not where the focus necessarily is. If anything, we might be getting away from that. One of the most depressing things about in the aftermath of Floyd was the KIPP schools saying we want to get rid of our motto of be nice, work hard, which was actually doing, the KIPP schools were incredibly successful. I hope that they still are despite the motto change. So based on academics, Harvard, all these schools care about, and you can also see it, you go from 12.7 to 1.9 UNC out of state. Now you could say, I realize this table's a little hard to read, you don't need to get into the numbers, but you could say, well, coming back to Elena's point, maybe they're strong on the other things associated with these things, and that generally is not true. The people who do well on academics tend to also be stronger on the other characteristics, such as extracurricular activities, teacher recommendations, stuff like that. So this is share scoring 2 or better in the first panel, which is for Harvard. That's sort of their scales on a 1 to 5. 2 or better would be like some form of a 2 or a 1. And there, Asian Americans, the typical ordering on these things is Asian Americans followed by whites, followed by Hispanics, followed by African Americans. So sort of the opposite of the way the preferences work. There's a couple of exceptions to that. The first is the personal rating, which was a big debate at the trial, where Asian Americans score the worst and whites score the best. And then the other is this athletic rating. People who do best on the athletic rating are actually white legacies, because this is sort of whether you might make the sailing team. So what's interesting is Asian Americans score the worst on the personal rating at Harvard. At UNC, they don't. So UNC, they have a different scoring system, but this is sort of above the median rating, and there, Asian Americans score better than whites on the personal rating. And so we're actually going to find no evidence of discrimination at UNC, either in the personal rating or overall, whereas at Harvard, you do see it both in the personal rating and overall on top of that. Go for it.
So like that difference between the basically the Asian American versus white discrimination that you find it at Harvard and don't find it at UNC. So what do you think are the main explanations? Because if it's just personal animus, either implicit or explicit, you have a hard time believing that the Harvard admissions counselors have like more personal animus, potentially. But then could be other things that, you know, if it's just like the admissions rate of the school, or it could be like need for donations. And if there's stereotype that Asian Americans are not going to donate money after they graduate, or it could be second order discrimination. They think the other students don't want a lot of Asian Americans there. So I guess seeing all of this, like, what do you think is going on for why you see the white versus Asian American discrimination?
I think that admissions officers had bought into the Brahmkendi. So Brahmkendi, I've been throwing that name out a lot. He wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. He's big on everything should be proportional everywhere. If it's not proportional to the population, then there's something racist about it. And so I think admissions officers are implicitly have been buying into this for some time. You know, they want to have a thing that looks like a representative of the population. And so
I would characterize Kendi as not saying that because if there's disproportion, then there must be something racist about it. I think he redefines in his lexicon, racism equates or non-proportional outcomes equate to racism. There's no even attempt to show animus or anything like that. He just changes the lexicon.
That's right. Yeah, that's a better way of putting it.
So what do they mean by represent? Because if that's the story, like, I mean, 70% of people on Earth are of Asian descent. So I guess
They
like
mean U.S.
Okay.
representation.
So it's America first kind of way of thinking.
Yeah,
I guess. Okay.
I mean, it's to find that's created problems. Like even our faculty, you know, with regard to pushes to be more representative. And you know, you have a guy from Romania. Well, he's disproportionate. There aren't that many Romanians in the Duke student body. We would have none on the faculty if we were going based on proportions. But to me, the rationale is right up here that 28% applicant share is so much bigger than the other shares at those other schools. That's why it's there. And that's even taking into account the selection that's happening. So that number should actually be higher. There's a bunch of Asian Americans who are not applying because they know the standards are higher and they have no hope. That's part of why you see them distributed in the way that they are across those academic indices, because they self-censor, you know. It's just remarkable. Like you look at those test scores among those top scoring SAT scores, it's just very disproportionately Asian American. And you could also say, well, look, in the population as a whole, Asian Americans actually have slightly higher incomes than the US nationally. But among applicants to Harvard, that's not going to be true. And what's going on there is these low-income Asian American families are preparing their kids in a way that would lead them to have a chance at applying to Harvard. That low-income group of other races are not doing at the same rate. And that's why you have things like Stuyvesant, where the exam-based school in New York City being heavily disproportionately Asian, despite the fact that they're actually poor. You know, so you see some of these. So to me, the answer to that question is that implicit wanting it to be representative of the U.S. population. That it's not being really applied to the prison system on the basis of gender, for example. You know, there where it's men represent, you know, what fraction of prisoners. So I mean, I do think it is a late, you know, set up that way.
Peter, sorry, just to follow up on this discussion. So we attribute these preferences to Harvard and UNC, but to what extent it's a multi-stage process. The actual officials in a different capacity matters. I'm thinking about the disability insurance process, and it's very well known that certain offices tend to reject disproportionately more applications than other offices in the United States. What is your sense of things? Do we have any measure that there is a person effect or particular subdivisions of the graduate admission office effect? Do you think this matters?
So
or it's generational, like preferences and cultural attitudes have changed, and people hired in the office, undergraduate admission office may have preferences that are representative of different generational cultural attitudes.
I wish I could do more with that. My own take is that they will make their admissions office be diverse in the sense of race and such. I don't think that they are that diverse in terms of political views. So my strong suspicion is that, particularly as test scores become less and less important in admissions, that it's actually going to lead to a lot more bias against conservatives in admissions. So, I mean, Stanford had that case where an applicant wrote what matters to you and why, and they wrote Black Lives Matter 150 times and got in. That's not something, the conservative equivalent of that is not going to
get you admitted.
It's not going to fly. So I do think that, but I think that the other point about that is how that works. Actually, it also, I think, works against those from poor backgrounds. And I think that can be part of the explanation for why we see this. You don't get as big you don't get a bump if you're a disadvantaged Black. You get a bump for being Black, but you don't get the disadvantaged part. And I think that's because how you talk about your racial experiences is different if you're from a richer background or a poorer background. I think a great example of that is Latinx, which I'm never sure if I'm saying that right. The reality is Latinx is incredibly unpopular among Hispanics, except elite. And so when you think about writing an essay as a low-income Hispanic, you're not going to use that word. But if you're coming from a richer family, you might. And that might resonate more with the admissions officer than that. So I think the admissions officers are diverse along a very selected dimension, but fit in with more of sort of a elite liberal mindset generally. That's opinion, not something I'm going to be able to show you here. So we're going to estimate models of Harvard admissions to keep track of everything here. I had mixed feelings about the fact that they merged the two cases. We had the Harvard case and UNC case. I had mixed feelings about it. Mixed because on the one hand, by merging the two cases, I felt like it took some of the emphasis off of the Asian American discrimination part, which I think is very real, and I don't want to slip away. Glad in the sense that I think that if people ever end up looking into this a bit more, they'll see that I was attacked on one side, Harvard took one approach to dismissing my models. UNC took the opposite approach. And so in Harvard, I was accused of not controlling for enough variables. At UNC, I was accused of controlling for too many variables. I controlled for way more at Harvard than in UNC. Now, that's not the full measure for whether the model could be overfit and so on. But it points to, there being differences there that I think I'm also just curious how the economists on the other side who filed those amicus briefs are going to somehow thread the needle to reconcile supporting both UNC's reports and Harvard's reports. So I think it's going to be very difficult to do.
What's the concern about over controlling the differences? Why does that invalidate?
Drown out the power of your test.
Yeah, they're basically saying my model is overfit. And so I'm going to talk about how formulaic UNC admissions are. And they'll say, well, that's because you had too many controls in your model.
But that would tend to lead you to fail to reject differences, right?
Yeah.
And what you're doing is rejecting.
Yes, but I think it also, well, I'll show you one way of measuring racial preferences where overfit would actually lead it to be making it look bigger than they are.
Okay.
So it depends on what we're, like if you look at in terms of the coefficient and the significance of the coefficient, that's going to be one thing, but there are other ways I'm going to walk through sort of 3 different ways, then you can see what you think.
Yeah, only 10 minutes.
10 minutes, great. So we're going to estimate these models control for a bunch of stuff. The broad patterns, large racial preferences for Hispanics, even larger preferences for African Americans. Already said, you get a bump for being disadvantaged. Substantially reduced, the disadvantage bump if you're for Hispanics is sometimes non-existent for African Americans.
Again, Hispanic is, I just self-identify.
I self-identified as Hispanic and did not self-identify as Black. So there's actually a racial hierarchy in the way this is set up. If you're Black, any part Black, you're gonna be classified as Black, then any part Hispanic, you get classified as Hispanic, then any part Asian, classified
But
as
again,
Asian.
it's me identifying.
It's you identifying, yeah. It's interesting because that was what they said is that the people use Native American. I think it'd be much easier to do Hispanic, to say I'm part Hispanic. But you don't, apparently that's hasn't been a concern. Just as an aside on the Asian Americans, given the time, I'm not going to get into that. That's a separate paper, but clear penalty at Harvard. Models are going to have a high degree of accuracy, especially at UNC. This is what, on this graph, I'm showing the predicted probabilities from the model. So how does that work? I use my model and then I say, okay, suppose we have a latent index there. I'll just take the people with the highest values of this latent index until I fill the class. If I do that, you can see what the predicted admissions probabilities are for all these things. That's actually accuracy that I'm going to talk about. Here's the distribution of the predicted probabilities. It's basically bimodal, right? And as it turns out, all the people who are close to 1, those are the people who actually are admitted. And all the people close to 0 actually get rejected. So it's actually really easy to forecast these admissions. And as what I meant also by UNC is at a disadvantage on holistic admissions relative to Harvard. There have to be more formulaic, just given their resources and such, compared to their number of applications. So these are the coefficients. I'm just going to say that they're there, but I'm going to focus on sort of, to Dan's point, you can look at the coefficient on African American and see that with limited set of controls, it's big and significant and bigger when you add up controls. These logit coefficients are crazy. These are logit coefficients. When do you see a 6 for a logit coefficient? So that might be why you might be worried about overfit, right? Because one of the things that's going on with the logit is everything's relative to the variance scale parameter. So if you're able to predict really well, it's all relative to that. That can lead to those estimates. So we actually show our models, that model is not overfit. We did the whole, I didn't know much about this stuff beforehand, but they have this k-fold cross-validation stuff. And Ken probably knows all about this, but we can show that the model actually does a great job out of sample. Yet you go to the judge's ruling and it talks about in the table of contents that my models are overfit. And that's right in the table of contents. My models predict better out of sample
So you basically just.
than my counterparts did in sample.
K-fold withholding.
Yeah.
1K every time. And
Yeah. So
based on the number of covariates and you end up with that.
Yeah, for the accuracy numbers, yeah.
So how should we think about this? You've got people who argue you have too many things in there, and people who argue you have too little or too few. What's the right number, or what are legitimate right-hand side variables in this prediction, and what are illegitimate? How do you?
The Goldilocks proposition, right?
Well, none of these seem like, at least I'd argue, seem like things you should drop, but I mean.
Yeah, but you can see there's actually a ton more variables that I'm not showing. But
what's the normative admissions model that you have in mind? Because that's going to drive what you should think is a legitimate thing, right?
I guess it depends on how we're defining legitimate. So from figuring out what Harvard's actually doing, you know, when I think about what they're doing is illegitimate, but no, that's not how you meant it. But
that's the argument on both sides.
Yeah.
Right? Is whether it's legitimate or not.
Well, so you can have it be from so personal rating's not in this preferred model. I have it in other ones, and that's because I believe race is taken into account in that. There are other ways we could have gotten a lot fancier to try to deal with these things, but fundamentally, if it was believed to be directly influenced by race, I didn't put it in there. But something like the athletic rating, that's in my model. It
I mean, but anything except race is legitimate.
in terms of what they could actually use.
Yeah.
There's a huge debate about that for sure. I'm saying take what Harvard's doing as given. How much of a role does race play on top of that? Whether Harvard should be using an athletic rating, that's a different fight.
So when in the case, did they basically tell you these are the factors that we consider? We're just not, it's a holistic admissions process, but these are factors we consider? Because that would then say those are the things you should put in. I mean, you know,
they would say they consider all those, all these things and more. That
so anything on the admissions form is legit, except for race.
Yeah, and I think some of them would say you can't quantify this. Yeah, because
so like high school and neighborhood variables, how detailed are those? And
so we got a bunch from the college board.
They seem to matter, maybe, because the coefficients do change when you put them in.
Yeah, that was one of the frustrating things, is that those are basically chosen by them.
By Harvard.
By card.
Oh.
So there's lots of stuff I wish I could have gone back on. I can't say anything more than that.
Okay.
I had a different way of controlling for it. I think his way is better, actually, in terms of he put in more characteristics. I had like these fixed effects for different regions that came from the college board. He included a lot more information. Whether that information was cherry picked, it's hard to tell.
Just to clarify, I mean, I guess his question is that Gratz and Grutter allow for that top row to be significant, and the question is just, is it too large to be consistent with Gratz and Grutter?
There's that, but then there's also an issue about whether what does it mean to be formulaic? The fact that there's no error. You need no error, because then it's just, if I can predict well over 90% of the admissions decisions correctly, both acceptances and rejects, that seems pretty formulaic, but I don't know where that line is.
Peter, we have to wrap up soon.
Okay. Yeah, so let me just tell you 3 ways you could look at, like, what a white male's with a 5% chance of admission, what would it change if you switched his race to Black or Hispanic, based on whether you're disadvantaged or not. You can see 5% goes to 96% for UNC out of state. Okay?
So that's just the delta on the logic probability.
Yeah. And then I'll skip that. We can look at the average marginal effects. So the actual admit rate at Harvard of 9.54%, average marginal effect of 7.3%. The reason at 9.54, that's higher than what we had before, because some people have characteristics that perfectly predict rejection, right? So those people are out. Look at the remaining people, 9.54%, average marginal effect is 7.3. This would be what the admit rate would be without racial preferences. So we're talking about a quadrupling. But UNC out of state, it's worse from that perspective, right? You go from 17.1 to 1.5%. Okay. UNC in-state, it actually has a larger marginal effect than Harvard, but that's because the base rate is so much higher. The share due to race is like 42%.
Is there some way you can express these findings in terms of standard hypothesis testing?
Say more about that. So they're all significant, for sure.
Well, okay, but that's.
How would you like me to do it?
No, you decide. I'm a federal district judge.
Okay. I think that this can say that, I think this can say,
Rates are the same.
yeah.
That much I think we got.
And I don't know what that means to say that narrowly tailored. I have no idea how do you test narrowly tailored? To me, my rule of thumb would be once affirmative action accounts for more than half the admissions, that's when I feel particularly uncomfortable, because I think that can really change the dynamics of what's happening within the college. But that's a rule of thumb.
Need some way of explaining that that's not just the result of sampling error.
Oh, no, it's definitely not a sampling error. That is for sure. These numbers are massively significant.
Hundreds of thousands of observations here.
Yeah.
So this satisfies the big data principle that every T statistic is at least 1 million.
Yeah, these T statistics are really big. There's no question about that.
Okay, so did you convince the judge, or what?
No, we lost on both cases, and then that's why it's at the Supreme Court now. Both judges could have brought in another expert to evaluate the 2 reports. Neither judge did. I don't think I don't think they're in a good position to evaluate.
Well, these are for Gilbert or for just court-appointed expert?
They could have done that. They could have done a court-appointed expert, but they didn't. I know I got to wrap up. We can actually calculate what percent of minorities people who've been admitted would have still been admitted if we remove the racial preference. Here we're actually, for Harvard, we only have this including the ALDCs. And again, we're talking about less, 8.1% of African Americans would have been admitted out of state if you didn't have the racial preferences. And then if you do that, some spots will open up when you remove racial preferences. This accounts for that, tells you sort of what the share of the admitted class would look like. But I'll end there. I'm sorry for going over.
So you skipped what happened at the appeals court.
Oh, at the appeals, they went with the other reports. They went with UNC and Harvard in both cases. Now,
it's proving the objectivity of the law.
The Thomas Jefferson decision that just came down. So Kavanaugh and Barrett voted with the liberals on that one, essentially, and Roberts, obviously, but it makes it seem like they will overturn Grass and Grutter, but allow for race neutrality. But all these institutions that are going to find very clever data scientists to do race neutrality to get what they want anyway. So are you just going to be back in court 5 years from now?
Well, I mean, that was a response to the removal of, to the fact that the Prop 16 failed. Is they said, okay, we're going to figure out a different way. We're not going to use test scores. So it's going to be this trade-off between 2 things, one which I think is good and the other is bad. So the getting rid of test scores, I think, is bad. The deliberately trying to manipulate the things to get around it may actually make things worse. The good reaction would be one that focused on trying to change what's happening prior to college, which would involve doing things like the charter schools and putting the effort in there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it seems unrealistic to me. So there's actually a paper in the American.
Well, that's not something that a college admissions office is going to do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's out of their hands. That's a societal problem of huge magnitude, but it's not something that the average college admissions office has any traction over.
But I think as a society, we would find it unacceptable if we ended up with Harvard being 1% African American. And so at that point, they would, take the steps necessary to try to change that. And if you look at like what happened after Proposition 209, it started off with a big hit in terms of minority enrollment, then came back up. The question is, how much did it came back up because it got around the rules versus actually improving the pipeline? So somebody like Rick Sander would say a decent chunk of it was because they did figure out better pipeline programs, getting the information
I guess you
out there.
Unintended consequences, because there's a paper in the AR by Eric Eister.
Yeah.
With this paper, I guess.
Yeah, Shannon Eister, right? Yeah.
Eister, which says like if you switch from this cherry picking stuff they do to this race neutrality, it could be bad for everybody. And they use like the Texas system as an example, where you might actually want to get the African American who's like 50th in a Dallas high school, than this Bush strategy of like the top 10% from each high school, and you get people on like the Rio Grande River that like are failing out of Austin the first semester.
Yeah.
Whereas it would have been better to get like the 60th ranked, 70th ranked Hispanic student from like San Antonio or Dallas. And this was an unintended consequence when you shift the incentives to be race neutral, which is what the courts might do.
I think that's a very realistic possibility. The flip side of that is it actually does lead to a lot more of the income diversity. The way this system's set up, it really favors
the minorities.
Exactly.
I'm curious, sorry, Peter, if there's a 30 seconds last question. How procedurally the expert witnesses process? What are the characteristics of your testimony versus card? They complain about you overfitting. Were you asked to submit pre-analysis plans? How was discipline?
So there's no pre-analysis plan for sure. I would have liked that actually exposed. But Card didn't accuse me of overfitting. So what Card objected to were how I treated the athletes and the legacies. He wanted those people in the model, and then what to do with the personal rating. Those are like the two big objections. If you look at Card's models, he's going to find huge racial preferences as well. There's no way to get around that in these models. But what you do see for Asian discrimination is that if you torture the data enough, you can get it to. But when you're talking about logit coefficients of 3, there's no way you can make those things go away. Go ahead, Paul.
So I have a point about the way the Supreme Court might react to this case. One way would be rule that we just got to get rid of affirmative action. It's been 25 years, and that's what Senator O'Connor said. There's 25 years of racial preferences and nothing after that. She said that in the Grutter case or the Michigan cases. And then the other possibility is they could make this an Asian American case and just say, okay, you can't discriminate against Asian Americans and keep in the affirmative action diversity, holistic approach, but just say you can't discriminate against Asian Americans, make it an Asian American case. I think bringing in the North Carolina thing is making that less likely. And actually, this is a good in the North Carolina side of the story.
I think that's right. I think that means that you can't do the narrow, just Asian part to that. It's interesting is you have on one hand the inefficiency that you mentioned that they're going to try to figure out a way to get around it. But there's a sense in which if you're for a little amount of preferences, you should actually hope that they outlaw racial preferences because they will do a little bit of racial preferences in response to that, subject to the inefficiency arguments. So how much are you losing out on the efficiency versus making the preferences not so large?
Peter, thank you so much. And we'll be around, ask you questions.
Great. Thank you.